Okay, so I said this at the beginning of my 2023 Advanced Viability Rankings video, and I don't remember exactly how I phrased it. That's not really important. The sentiment is the same. And you might not have seen that video, in which case go check it out. Or you might not remember it. Either way, I will reiterate it here because it very much applies. I really don't think viability rankings should be taken too seriously. I mean, the general idea is obviously great. No argument against it. But I think when you start arguing the minutia of whether Gyarados is really better than Heatran or stuff like that, then you really start losing the point. I mean, that stuff is fun to argue for experienced players, because it's going to lead to an even deeper understanding of the metagame. It's like, well, I think Heatran because of the way it supports teams. Well, I think Gyarados because of the way it supports teams and ends games. Well, Heatran support is this and that, and it's better than what Gyarados does more consistently, that kind of stuff. That stuff is interesting, for sure. But even in those kinds of debates, you will not find an objective answer. Right? And I'm not, please don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about there's no objective truth, anything like that, okay? So what I really mean is that you can have all that laid out, and you still will not come to some sort of truth in the same way that we might say Snorlax is objectively the best Pokemon in Gen 2 OU, right? That is not what I'm talking about here. So you are just going to have to accept that viability rankings are a reflection of player opinions, both the individual viability rankings and then the sum total of those viability rankings that are sent in that represent the averaged out consensus of everyone who was asked to submit theirs. And though that consensus is what you see when you open up that DPP viability ranking thread, which I'll leave a link to in the pinned comment. So this is my submission for those. These are this is my personal view of the metagame. It's like with rating movies or something. It's like you try to strike a balance between personal play style, personal preference, and objective. This is what this thing does in the metagame. And even if I don't use it, then I understand why it's good. I appreciate it for that kind of thing. So, and more than anything else, viability rankings have the purpose of just illuminating what the metagame is generally. So, whether or not Breloom is better than Skarmory, for example, you can argue that case all the live long day, but at the end of the day, they are similarly good. And you're not really going to have any sort of meaningful difference. Even if you find that Skarmory is objectively one place higher than Breloom, let's just imagine, right? Then it's still not going to really change much of anything. You want to know what the metagame is generally. But, it's a fun exercise, so, okay. So, S-Rank, Latias comes in at number 1 for me. I made a video about this recently, and you can go check that out. So that saves me some time here. But yeah, Latias pretty much just fits on every team, and not to say that every team needs it, but it fits on every team very nicely. And it does so much. That speed and just good enough power. I say just good enough, not to say that it's not strong, but it's not eviscerating entire teams instantaneously. But it's strong enough to threaten things reasonably, of course. I hate to be that guy who's like, oh, well, base 110 special attack specs Draco just isn't strong enough. But I mean, it's not 2 KOing max special defense Clef, and so the benchmark is pretty high for power in DPP these days, when defensive teams are so prominent and so good. So, Latias does a lot, just not in terms of speed and switching in and then dishing out power, but also utility, especially Trick and Healing Wish. And defensive teams, it's a phenomenal glue for them as well. T-Tar, I think people were down on T-Tar for a while, but I mean, it's just outstanding. And people kind of forgot that it was such an amazing pursuiter, which is kind of wacky. But I think it was just a combination of overreactions, I guess, because there was a while in DPP in the 2010s where people could not make teams without Starmie and they could not make teams without T-Tar. And Starmie falling more to the wayside is, that makes more sense because, hazards, that's a whole hazard debate about how getting rid of hazards is so much tougher than just ignoring them and, abusing your own and that kind of dance. And Starmie is obviously going to have less of a place in this. But people crutched on T-Tar really hard, and then they were discovering that not every team needed T-Tar. But in doing that, then they kind of forgot that the reason T-Tar was so spammed in the first place was that it switches into everything, and it pursuits everything. It's absolutely insane. Nothing like catching a Specs Heatran Overheat and then pursuing it for a little bit. And you think, oh, that doesn't make much of a difference. It does. I have a video called The Power of Pursuit for this very reason. Nothing like pursuing not very effective pokes. But I mean, it's not just that, obviously. Like, T-Tar facilitates... A lot of these stall teams, they are very solid defensively, of course, but T-Tar is one of their best... Well, it's actually one of the best tools on those defensive teams as well. That's what I mean. T-Tar fits on everything. But for offense as well, you just get a little bit of pursuit chip on something like Clef or, Latias, of course, as well. Then... And, of course, the way it deals with Rotom. Look at how it threatens all these staples so hard. And it's not easy to wall either. Simple Fire Blast, and Skarm's not dealing with it anymore. Choice Band is always tough to switch into. And, so T-Tar helps dissect these teams. It's very systematic. People sometimes have the idea of the one Pokemon stall breaker as opposed to it being a team effort. And T-Tar helps make the team effort a viable option, because sometimes people say, oh, I'll just beat them through offensive pressure, but they don't really have the tools to break past the divide and conquer tactic of the opposing stall team. And T-Tar is so forceful in what it does that it makes it consistently is able to do that. So, and of course defensively it's a pillar of everything, obviously. People started thinking Dragon Dance kind of comes and goes. People will either think that DD is a super underrated, monster that rips through the entire metagame, and then it gets used too much, and it doesn't become bad. I would never say that, but people definitely slap it on too haphazardly, let's say. And they expect it to perform these miracles when you got to remember it's not that strong, not that fast for a D-Deer. So it's a menace late game for sure, but it has to be wielded precisely. You can also do a lot of cool things with it, obviously. T-Tar's move pool is endlessly customizable, but you got to be real smart when making a DD-Tar team because you cannot rely on it defensively, and very few things do what T-Tar does defensively. Jirachi, long time considered the number one Pokemon in the tier after displacing Heatran after a while. And, I would never say that it's, not one of the best Pokemon in the tier, obviously. It's just that I think the other two are even better. I don't think Jirachi's gotten any worse at all. I don't really look at it as like, oh, it used to be number one, now it's number three. What made it worse? I don't think anything got worse. I think it was just really coming to appreciate just how great Lottie and T-Tar are. But, yeah, Jirachi does the same things it always does. What I really appreciate about Jirachi is that people have been using the Paraflinch sets for so long, but that it seemed like running anything besides that was pretty unviable. But, and I'm happy to have... kind of proud to have played some sort of role in this, and I'm not the only one who's done this, of course, not at all. But I think Calm Mind Jirachi reminding everyone that it is an insane threat is one of my favorite developments of late, especially because one of the toughest parts about dealing with defense in DPP is the unkillability of Clef, right? And it's very difficult to find something strong enough to punish these kinds of teams that run Clefable in place of Blissey. Because it used to be Blissey is so unkillable that you need to directly remove it somehow, or T-Spikes or something, or it's just going to sit on you forever, right? and it's not Clef is immovable in a different way, in that it will never get worn down through chip damage. But I mean indirect chip damage. T-Tar Pursuit is actually a great example, and of course pairs beautifully with Calm Mind Jirachi. But yeah, it's very difficult to find something that really overwhelms Clef through sheer power, consistently anyway. I mean, there are plenty of Pokemon that can do it. It's just not easy. Like offensive Suicune, for example. I just made this video about the DPP Cup Finals, and you saw Clefable like taking on offensive Hydro Suicune like it was nothing. So you got things like Specs Heatran, for example, but that's not the easiest Heatran set to slap on. Now, Jirachi is not going to be winning any awards for power with its Calm Mind sets, but what it is going to do is make up for it, more than make up for it, with longevity. Because the problem with something like Suicune is that, sand, rock's neutral, and you think, oh, well, it's not rock's weak. Let me tell you, rock's neutral can be death in this tier because of sand. Unless you have like reliable recovery or something, but it's Suicune famous for its longevity issues. Milotic is much less bothered by its Stealth Rock neutrality than Suicune, for example, because it heals reliably. But yeah, Jirachi with that sand immunity, that rock's resistance, and toxic immunity, that means it's really easy to stay in and bludgeon Clef over and over, and Clef can't beat it through longevity. Something like Suicune, if it's losing health in sand, it's only got 8 Hydro PP, then Clef can mess with that really easily. But a little bit of chip on Clef, and suddenly, when it can't just put Jirachi on a timer, then it's really terrifying. And obviously it rips through most everything else. So Super Jirachi, if wielded right, with the right support, with the right setup for it, then it is one of the scariest things for defense. And obviously it's a natural offense killer as well, because that great speed tier, great bulk, great typing, solid power. And its move pool is amazing, of course. I think the discovery of Draco Meteor on Calm Mind Jirachi is really excellent, because obviously you don't have to run Draco Meteor on it. And again, I keep stressing Pursuit T-Tar support. Which it's weird that Pursuit T-Tar has somehow become underrated, but people, I'm serious. Look at the games. It's definitely not the same now as it was before, where you couldn't step outside for running into a Pursuit T-Tar. But yeah, Pursuit T-Tar is obviously excellent support for Jirachi either way, and with it, if you play well with it and you don't get worn down super quickly, then you are able to help it deal with defensive Latias, so that you don't need to run Draco for it. But it's also nice, even if you do have Pursuit T-Tar, if you can fit Draco on your moveset, then you don't need to task T-Tar with getting rid of Latias for you. You can focus more on weakening Clef, or getting rid of Rotom for something else, that kind of thing. Being your Stealth Rocker, maybe. Just generally switching in and not having to preserve your health, because you got to get rid of that Latias at all costs. And I think Lum on Super Jirachi. I think I mentioned this in the DPP OU underrated sets video, but I can't stress it enough. That, I think, is the biggest difference, even more than Draco Meteor, from before and now. Before it was always lefties. Now it's got to be Lum. You got to have that for the opposing para Jirachi. Defense, especially defensive Jirachi. I mean, they're physically defensive now, and for a good reason. Breloom. So that's also important, that the Jirachis are less specially defensive now. But even so, then the Fire Punch Jirachis, the special, excuse me, goodness. Especially defensive Jirachis, and the Fire Punch Jirachis, they are a lot less able to stand in Super Jirachi's way if they can't ruin you with one paralysis. That's really big. Or even something like when you're muscling through Clef. Clef doesn't run T-Wave all the time, but if it can't just mess you up with one T-Wave, then it's a completely different game. And of course, I also recommend this Jirachi with Healing Wish support from Latias as well. Really, if you can just throw it at your opponent over and over and over, it is one of the best muscle Pokemon in the tier. So yeah, offensive Calm Mind Jirachi with Pursuit Tar support, with Healing Wish support, maybe with Draco Meteor, excellent. And that's really where Jirachi shines to me. right now, because it doesn't have the sheer power nor the super effective coverage, all the super effective coverage it wants for it to dissect both offensive and defensive teams it wants, as well as it wants with mixed sets. So those sets are definitely good, but they're more for maintaining. They're more for checking things defensively. You check a Chuka Berry on them, it takes hits from DDers, it hits them back. Iron Head, Fire Punch, T-Bolt, Ice Punch. Those are fine. They can be very annoying for offense, but they are not the wall breaker that you sometimes need it to be. So it can't be slapped on teams as easily. But yeah, and the parasets are obviously as nasty as ever. I think offensive, Iron Head, Body Slam, Fire Punch, protect and sub, all that other stuff is great. But I think Refresh is really good on those as well. And I think that's a theme. It's why Lum is great on like offensive Calm Mind Latios, or all sorts of T-Tars, especially Pursuit. And even just Refresh on Jirachi. Then it's a response to Para Jirachi taking over the metagame so much. And even things like Scarf Magnezone, switching into Jirachi just to T-Wave it and ruin it forever. Then, you refresh that off and you are sitting pretty. Obviously, Lum on Super Rachi also helps you deal with things like Will-O-Wisp Rotom. Lum on a Super and Mixed Rachi is also great because it lets you act as an early game switch into Breloom, which is phenomenal for reversing momentum. It even helps you pivot around Machamp, worst comes to worst. Yeah, great item, lots of flexibility, highly recommend. People have been using Rest Talk Jirachi on Stall just for the full Breloom Absorb. I'm not the biggest fan of that set. I think it's got some cool stuff, but I think Protect is just too good, and it's got a lot of vulnerability. And as soon as Breloom Swords dances, then that plan goes down the toilet anyway. So, yeah. That's the S rank. Now, A+. I do think Heatran is excellent. Sometimes people's opinions on Heatran just it kind of drives me insane sometimes. It's like, oh, it doesn't automatically OHKO Clef. Let's Flygon. Like, this is when I knew that whole last year's viability rankings. It involved everyone in this like mass hallucination where they thought mixed Flygon was broken, and it was top 5 or something. When people are coming out of that reverie now, but that was one of the strangest trances I've ever been privy to. And it was like, oh, Mixed Flygon is so broken that even if it switches into Heatran Lava Plume and gets burned, that it's still broken. Like, give me a break. So yeah, I'm glad people are coming to their senses and seeing, oh, Heatran is good again. I mean, this is what I mean about viability rankings stuff kind of being way too in the moment and missing the big picture. Like, you genuinely, like, I feel like an idiot sometimes when I say things like Advanced T-Tar is underrated, DPP T-Tar is underrated, DPP Heatran is underrated. But it's like, people genuinely do think insert top Pokemon here is not as good now. They said about Advanced Salamence years ago and Aerodactyl. And it's like, you just step back and look at its innate traits, those fundamental parts of what make it good that just don't change. And you just think, it's not like a Shaman case where Shaman was completely had its viability destroyed by the rise of Clefable. Whereas Heatran is a much more robust Pokemon. It does a lot more than Shaman ever did. Shaman was cool for sure, but Rise of Clefable really killed it, and then Latios pretty much eclipsed it entirely. That was the final nail in that coffin. So, yeah, I do feel like a bit of a jackass going, yeah, Heatran is underrated, but people were genuinely saying, oh, it's not that good. I've seen people say it's not a top 10 Pokemon, so if I seem like I'm exaggerating a little or being a little well-duh with, wow, Heatran's good, who knew? I promise I would not be making statements this strong if I hadn't seen some absolutely wacky stuff surrounding it in the not-so-recent past. A recent and not-so-recent past, excuse me. So yeah, Heatran obviously does a million things. I'm a big fan of Scarf. I think it's underrated. The reason Scarf died out in the first place was because you need longevity on your Heatran to deal with Para-Rachi, which completely warped the metagame. That's going to be a video. And if you have a Heatran that is Scarf and it's switching into Para-Rachi and getting paralyzed, well, no speed. at least a non-lefties Heatran that gets paired can still be threatening. But if you're Scarf and you're not even getting the speed out of it, then what's the point? But I think as people started using other ways to deal with Pararachi, then Scarf Heatran is definitely good again. And I keep harping on this every time I mention it, but I can't emphasize enough how good it is. It's a Scarfer that's useful against defense. Scarf Latias is good in this vein because it's got Trick, it's got Healing Wish, but Heatran is a Scarfer that has Explosion. So against offensive teams, you got your speed, you got your strong Fire Blast, all that. It's great. It's very threatening. Gyarados isn't like switching into you with Rocks and Sand up if it can't force you out after. But you also, not to say that Heatran can't do that even if it goes plus speed, because Gyarados should always be adamant, but Heatran really likes plus special attack in this metagame, I feel. The speed, I mean, it's nice, but there are other ways to deal with the D-Deers that you'd outspeed by going plus speed, the Dragonite and Gyarados. But you really need that power for Blast to do Clef and Latias with the Dragon Pulse, and overwhelming T-Tars with Earth Powers and stuff like that. So, plus special attack Heatran. And with Scarf, you don't have that problem. You get the best of both worlds. And against your offense, you're threatening, and against your defense, then you bait in something bulky and you blow it up. Clef or Latias, either way, you're going to enjoy that. For something like a Super Rachi, hey, there it is again. And with Dragon Pulse on Scarf Heatran, which I like, then if they're going to try and check you with Latias first, then you could Dragon Pulse that, and then they're going to have to deal with you with Clef. Obviously, you got to have a plan for the T-Tar, but again, breaking stall teams is not just the job of one busted Pokemon that just massacres everything. It's got to be part of a team effort. So, Scarf Heatran is great because it's a good Scarfer, and it is worth, depending on your team, it can be worth running plus speed Scarf Heatran if you really like it to check D-Knight and Gara. But if you can handle those with something else, then I really recommend plus special attack, because that speed on such a powerful Pokemon is really, really nasty against offense. So, yeah, I've harped on about Scarf a lot, but that's because its other sets are fairly self-explanatory. There's so much variety to it. You can run Spadef and still blow it up. You can run subsets of all shapes and sizes. That probably wasn't the best expression, excuse me. I gotta make lunch after this. I'm cooking salmon because I want to, and it's healthy and delicious. So, subsets, offensive, like wall-breaking sets, like basically Scarf, but with a different item instead of Scarf. Fire Blast, Earth Power, Dragon Pulse, HP Grass, Boom, Taunt. I guess you wouldn't run Taunt on Scarf. I like Scarf on, Rocks on Scarf as well. So again, Scarf Heatran, underrated. Talk about it. And yeah, Magma Storm, if you can get past that horrible accuracy, then it can do some really nasty things as well. Like, they can't pivot around. What I really think makes it worth it is that a lot of what dealing with Heatran is for defensive stuff is pivoting around it and like catching it on an inopportune turn, hoping to have it blow up on one thing as opposed to another, or getting Latias in on an Earth Power so you don't Earth Power the T-Tar and the Switch, that kind of thing. And with Magma Storm, not only do you get extra chip on everything that's not Clefable, which is really big, but then you guarantee that you hit your target, and that is really big for consistency. And you know what? I really even think it's worth using Wide Lens sometimes, because that accuracy is just so bad. And going from 70 to 77, huge difference. Hey, that's better than a regular Will-O-Wisp. So, yeah, Heatran does so much for pretty much every team, and it's excellent. Breloom. Breloom is really, also self-explanatory, I think. The reason Breloom is this high is just because of how important it is in wresting control over a game. Not just with Spore, but in its longevity, and how it's not afraid of Clefable's knockoff, because once Toxic Orb is activated, of course. That's a huge, very unique trait for it. So it's going to be able to threaten, and it's going to be able to do it again and again with Sleep, and also with its cavalcade of amazing offensive moves. And obviously it's got the standard of Mach, Seed Bomb, Superpower, Focus Punch. You can combine these, like they see Focus Punch and then Scarm's like, well, okay, well the Breloom can't Focus Punch a second time, and then you unleash Superpower and it's just death. It's amazing. It's a good lead. It's great with Sash. Scarf Breloom, underrated. I like that one. And it can run defensive sets really well as well, with Leech Seed and Protect being just insufferable to deal with. Toxic Breloom is really good because you're like, oh, well, my bulky Zapdos will such and such. And no, your bulky Zapdos won't. Neither will your bulky Latias. Neither will your Wing Attack Gliscor. You know, because Wing Attack Gliscor, oh, well, it's neutral to rocks and it's immune to sand, so it's the most reliable. It's not weak to U-turn or Pursuit. Those are the flaws most of Breloom's checks face. But, yeah, Breloom has a way of ruining pretty much every one of its checks, and it comes in so reliably. And even against offense, it's, I mean, there's a Pokemon called T-Tar, there's Waters, there's all sorts of choice moves it resists, like Earthquake. It even resists, like, Scarf T-Bolt. So, yeah, Breloom, excellent. Does it all. And I can't overemphasize its importance for offensive and defensive teams alike. It's an anchor of several balanced teams because it's such a good defensive Pokemon in terms of longevity and switching into things like Gyarados, but it's also such a terror offensively. So that combination is really tough to beat. Or it's sorry, a better way of expressing that would be that its combination of traits is really pretty much impossible to replicate. You can't just slap Machamp in the Breloom slot and be like, oh, well, that's the same thing. You know, I mean, I know all the fighting types are dynamic and unique in their own way, but something like, let's say, Lucario and Infernape or Machamp and those guys, those are a lot more interchangeable than Breloom, let's say. Swords Dance is just an absolute terror. And, you know, so many Breloom sets are so good they don't even need Spore. That's how good it is. And you can never appreciate just how good Mach Punch is for keeping everything in check. You know, not just things that hit super effectively like DD Tar and Agility and Polion, which is obviously amazing, but just picking off weakened things is just amazing, of course. Gara. A lot of people are really high on Gara right now. Obviously Gara is really excellent, but I think that Gara being as highly valued by some as it is now is a bit of a fad. I mean, look, I'm not going to say no to appreciating what Gara does more. I think people are just more and more aware, not that they weren't before, but they're really aware now of how game-ending one flinch from a +1 Gara can be, and how it can run away with games, you know, a lot quicker than Jirachi can, even, which is kind of hilarious to think about. Obviously, it happens less, but look, if it just needs one flinch or a crit, you know, that's over 20% odds, and that's a crunch defense drop. That's uncomfortably high. So think about how often crits happen, and then think about Ice Beam freezes, and T-Bolt pairs, which happen way more. Funnily enough, Flamethrower burns don't happen nearly as much. Probably because Flamethrower isn't used as much as Fire Blast, and Fire Blast misses more than it burns. But, yeah, T-Bolt pairs and Ice Beams are higher than that, and then Crunch is twice as much as those, and then the Flinch is that rate, you know, plus the crit, because if it crits you, then it's just as good as flinching. So, yeah, uncomfortable. I mean, obviously, it's usually in these situations that it's just, if you hit the Gyarados back, then you'll be fine. Because it's like a Zapdos or a Rotom trying to T-Bolt it. But, yeah, Gara fits on all sorts of teams because I think those hyper-offense teams that lead off with Gara once Ace Level's gotten rocks up, they're great, obviously, and they're good to keep opponents honest, but you can't over-rely on them. Otherwise, you're just going to, you know, find your offensive plan stifled by someone who remembers that Gyarados exists in the team builder. And I think Gara is at its most threatening when it's wielded dynamically. Like DD Tar. It's actually funny because Gara is so good defensively, has such a wonderful list of resistances, and Intimidate obviously is amazing. So when you rely too much on it to DD, then you wind up losing out on a big part of its game, and that's why I'm such a big fan of Choice Band, because you just get in, hit hard, you don't have to worry about preserving it for that perfect sweep opportunity, which might not even happen, and might not even present itself. And you just hit harder immediately. So if your opponent pivots to Scarf Rotom, for example, then you don't say, okay, well, either I DD and do nothing, or I Waterfall and I hit them pretty hard. No, you immediately Waterfall and smack them incredibly hard. And you put a lot of pressure on things like Skarmory as well. Just because a lot of dealing with Gara is a turn issue, Because, of course, Choice Band doesn't have that snowball effect where it just runs away with the game. But a lot of dealing with DD Guerra is about, okay, well, it needs that turn to DD. So, and you take that away from them, and you've got a real monster on your hands. Yeah, so ban Guerra, immediate power, lets it use its defensive profile to get more offense out of it, pretty much. So, yeah, I'm a big fan. Guerra's obviously fantastic. Skarm, I mean, this one we're not going to spend any time on. This is obviously an amazing Pokemon, and you've got, and it anchors defensive teams, and it's immune to spikes, and it's part of that whole dance that's been going on for a long time. Lead Scarm, okay, I will say Lead Scarm is really good if you use Icy Wind on it, so you don't just pray that you're not facing taunt leads. So, yeah, that's pretty much it. Skarm is great, obviously. Clef, some people want Clef banned, which I think is a little much, but I get it. It's fantastic, and it's got such an endless array of what it can do. You know, obviously, it would be good even if it's only 3 moves were Seismic, Knock, and Soft Boiled. But, I mean, you start throwing in Rocks, Encore, T-Wave, Wish, Protect. I've seen Healing Wish on some teams. I think that's really good. So, yeah, I think that Clef is great. It's pretty simple in what it does. It really forces you to be precise with your offensive game plan, because you can't just kind of coast with hazards. It's kind of like the one, if you want to use a modern gen example, it's like the one heavy-duty boots Pokemon. You gotta deal with it directly. Except there's still Pursuit in the game, so that dynamic isn't as obnoxious. So, yeah. Heatran, a lot of the time, I think a good item for it is Charcoal, so Clef can't take 2 Fire Blasts from it. You can also do things like Taunt, of course. But I think a Heatran should generally be ready to lose its item when fighting Clef one-on-one, which is also why I'm an advocate for Wide Lens, stuff that you're not going to miss too much. But of course, that can also extend to things like Resist Berries, like Chople, Shuka, Pasho, always great. Custap, stuff that against defensive teams you're not going to be using as much. Yeah, Lefty, I'm not obviously never going to say no to lefties. I mean, that's huge. I think lefties is good not just for dealing with Jirachi repeatedly, but also for being more of a threat to defense if you're able to hit them again and again and again and again. And because a lot of times defense, like you'll see this a lot when defense is dealing with Specs Heatran. It's like, well, I'm dealing with it one Stealth Rock switch at a time, and maybe a T-Chart Pursuit, right? But if you got lefties, then it's not really an option. You know, they can't just turn your own lack of longevity against you. So, yeah, you got, as long as you're conscientious of how you're dealing with Latias, Clef, T-Tar, and the occasional Quagsire or Milotic, then in your moveset and in your team support, then Heatran is going to take you places. And I realize this was about Clef, but yeah, Clef, there's not really much to say about it. It's very simple. I think, yeah, that's pretty much it. Okay, A. So it feels weird ranking these guys solo because I think they're so great. That's another part of why viability rankings can be, such a kind of finicky exercise sometimes. But yeah, Metagross is just superb. Anything that tricks with Metagross, I think, is really good. I'm a big fan of Scarf. It's kind of like Heatran. A lot of teams, offensive teams, will deal with its bludgeoning by just outspeeding it, taking advantage of its weaknesses because it's not that fast. Rock Polish can obviously fix this too, but you are losing immediacy and a move in your moveset. Whereas on Scarf, you can unload that Scarf against defensive teams. That's why it's so good. You just completely ruin something on defensive teams. And against offense, you're good to go. And yeah, you don't have to make that awful choice between Explosion and something else. I think like funky stuff like Pursue and Ice Punch and T-Punch on Scarf Metagross, they're a waste. You gotta stick with what it's good at. So that's always going to be useful. Mash, EQ, Trick, Boom. Now, if you have a good reason to put Stealth Rock on it or something, then, if you've thought it through, then I will never say no to that. Again, guidelines, not rules. But I find that all that other stuff, because there are a lot more games where there are other ways to deal with Gyarados, first of all. Second of all, you can do a lot worse than just tricking it or booming it or something. Third of all, you are going to have a lot more games where T-Punch on Scarf Gross is kind of useless. Or Pursuit, for example. All it really does is Pursuit Gengar. It doesn't really do that particularly well because it's not stabbed or technician like Scarf Scizor, for example. So, yeah, I stick with what's going to be consistently useful. Yeah, Trick Iron Ball is obviously great. I think Lefty's Metagross in general, just utility rock sets, even 4 attacks. Toxic Protect Metagross is actually a phenomenal set. That should get used more. But yeah, I think those Lefty sets, they're like Heatran. They give you a lot of longevity against Jirachi and Latias. Sand immunity, Toxic immunity, Rock resistance for Metagross. That's even better than Heatran. And it's obviously good at giving you some backbone against T-Tar. Threatens Clef more directly than just Boom. So obviously you have to help it out against things like Skarm and Rotom, but if you do, then that Boom is going to find something that's going to be nasty. And Metagross just combines longevity with power, bulk. It's fantastic. And obviously you can start off games wonderfully with lead, but that's more of a known commodity at this point. And I think agility, is always an underappreciated choice. I like those hyper offense teams that don't forget agility Metagross exists, because it's just like they throw the 3 D-Deers at you and then kind of forget that there's another one of the best physical cleaners in the game also there. I've also seen some physical offense teams with Trick Iron Ball Gross, and I think that's really good to help them out in their struggles against Skarmory. Now, you can't just have a Trick Iron Ball Gross and say, okay, I'm good against defense, because they're going to have other pokes. They're going to have, their Quagsires, their Rotoms. So you gotta have some support, and but that's not unreasonable. And you just have to make sure that you're taking advantage of whatever that Iron Ball ruins. Gliscor, it's got some funky sets now. It's got Scarf being used sometimes. It's got offensive SD, which I'm a big fan of, and defensive SD I think is cool too. But I think just good old Taunt Gliscor. I remember back in 2010, me and my buddy Roscoe were talking. I was just like. We were talking about like the scariest kinds of teams to face, and he mentioned, oh yeah, if you got a Swampert lead and you face a Rose team, you are in for a rough ride. And I agreed, of course, but my scariest kind of team to face was always just Scarf T-Tar plus Taunt Gliscor. Those are just so ruthless in locking you down. And I think Taunt Gliscor is perpetually underrated somehow. Except maybe when the metagame revolved around it for a long time, a decade plus ago. But yeah, Gliscor is great, and it always feels underexplored. People forget it. It's a great U-turn user. It's an outstanding U-turn user, and it can fit knockoff into its moveset, which is just superb at. So yeah, Gliscor, great, simple. Swampert. I like it as an alternate choice bander to Gyarados sometimes, just because of the longevity factor. You got your Rock's Resist and Sand Immunity as opposed to Weakness and Vulnerability, respectively. And you've also got the secondary Stab and Earthquake, which hits really hard. And another, this one's really big, I think, one of the most important, is Superpower. So you directly threaten Clefable, because Clef can check what CB Gyara is up to, without Protect, even, just by soft boiling, if it comes to that. So you don't get your Latias outraged on a switch or something like that. But against Swampert, it's a lot less safe. So you're immediately threatening it, and you can make something happen without getting scouted. And that makes you in control. That's you putting the pressure on, as opposed to you being forced to go for Waterfall. So you at least damage the Clef that is going to try and scout you, which it can safely. And sometimes the other player is going to say, well, since the other player knows that I'm going to scout with Clef because it's so free, that means Waterfall is coming. That means my Latias switch is super safe, because the Waterfall is forced. But if you have that situation against a CB Pert, and you have a Clef out against it, you can't say, oh, well, I'm going to scout what this Pert's going to do, because what that Pert could do is Superpower and Oko you immediately. And that means you are more free to go for that Ice Punch against the Latias switch, or what have you. Or the Breloom switch, for example. So, yeah, that's my case for CB Pert. Specs Pert is okay, for sure, but I think it loses a lot of potency once the surprise factor wears off. It's just not as strong, doesn't threaten Clef as much, but definitely worthwhile. Offensive Pert is great. Tank Pert is obviously, a classic. People always say, oh, well, Tank Pert's not so good anymore. It's like, no, come on. Tank Swampert is always going to... It's just fundamentally... As long as there are these physical attackers in the tier, Tank Swampert is going to be great. Especially like seeing the old school Protect to really stretch as much longevity out of it as possible. I even like... I've made some teams with 3 attacks Protect. So like an offensive Swampert with a Magnezone support. And you've got... so you got the offensive pressure... that it's going to be putting on a lot of teams very easily. But you've also got the longevity, and you kind of make up for your more offensive-leaning spread by using Protect to increase your hit-taking abilities. So yeah, that's Pert. Flygon. Flygon is a great Pokemon, obviously. Once you get past that silly Mixed Gon is broken thing that was going around. I mean, Mixon is obviously a great Pokemon. I'm a big fan of Outrage on it, just to really help you mash your way through sheer force through not Dragonite, sorry. I was thinking of the same set on Dragonite. But Hippo and Clef, those are the big ones. Because they can take Draco into whatever, and you're going to need a little bit of chip damage just to really seal the deal, but I mean, that's what your teammates and your own player are for. So yeah, it's great. Scarfgon is great. I like some utility offense sets like U-Turn, D-Claw, EQ, Filler. Protect, I think, is really great. Toxic, Sub, Screech. If you use Sub, you don't use U-Turn, obviously. But those are really underrated, I feel, with good support. And the Flygon set, I think, is really outstanding. That doesn't get the use it should is Choice Band. That is potentially one of the scariest pokes in the tier. It had its like moment in the sun like a decade ago, but it's still now. That immediate Garchomp stab combination with the strong U-turn, and on a speed tier that's as good as it is in this metagame, alongside Super Hachi, it's absolutely ferocious. I think CB Gon really needs to see use. Rotom's great. I mean, I'm not going to go too much over how Scarf and Rest Talk are pillars of their respective team styles. Instead, I'll just say more, I think offensive Rotom is sorely underused. Sub-split, whether it's max HP or max special attack. Lefties or Life Orb. Or Colbur Berry. Colbur Berry is a great one, of course. Sometimes you can get rid of that sub-split and just use all that utility. I really like that one. T-Bolt, Wisp, Split, HP Ice, stuff like that. Or Choice Specs, another great one. I even like Rain Dance Rotom sometimes. All sorts of Rain Dance Rotoms, but one in particular I like is T-Bolt, Rain Dance, Hydro, Shadow Ball, and at the peak of Breloom's obnoxiousness, I used HP Flying, and I gave it to Blunder for a tournament, and he OHKO'd a Breloom with it from full, and I thought that was just beautiful. But yeah, I think both of those are great. Damp Rock, Colbur Berry, some sort of boosting item, Life Orb if you like. But yeah, it's great for facilitating something like Specs Kingdra. And it's just a great Pokemon to have in general. Clear the weather for something like a Sub Suicune. Yeah, so Rotom, fantastic. Pretty simple. Empoleon, you can never give Empoleon enough love. I think it's just so excellent. Whether it's a lead, whether it's a utility mid-game set, the more offensive variants with Shuka Berry or Chople Berry or Wackenberry, or even lefties, or then you go all out into defensive territory. It's got Knockoff, Surf, Roar, Rocks, of course, Toxic, Yawn, Ice Beam. I really like bulky Ice Beam, so that Breloom thinks, oh, it's going to Surf and knock off, I'll waltz into this, and you just knock it on its ass. So, yeah, Empoleon, absolutely excellent. That typing, resisting Dragon and Water, great for Latias and the underrated Kingdra. Excellent stuff. Agility is obviously great. Swords Dance is good. Specs is really underrated. That's a terror. That's the strongest Hydro Pump in OU. Talk about unwallable. And it's got amazing longevity because Rocks Resistance and Sand Immunity and Toxic Immunity. So sometimes people like blasting through defensive teams with Specs Hydro because, oh, Clef can't wall it. Latias is afraid of Ice Beam, da-da-da. But those Specs Hydros generally come from Pokemon that are very vulnerable to the passive damage that these stall teams so revel in. Sand, Spikes, Toxic, Sand, Rocks, Toxic. Starmie, Kingdra, they're vulnerable in that sense. Swampert, not as vulnerable. Obviously, it's got the Rock's immunity, Rock's resistance and sand immunity. Putting aside the toxic weakness it has for a second, but it's also a lot weaker. A lot weaker compared to Empoleon. Sometimes people will even run like Specs Vaporeon for the sheer power, because Vaporeon is crazy strong, but it's also super vulnerable to all that stuff. Whereas Empoleon is even stronger than Vaporeon and has great longevity. So, yeah, Specs Empoleon, great. And I even like Scarf Empoleon, but I realize that's a little radical of me. Zapdos. Zapdos is one of those things that people were like, oh, pre-Latias is broken, post-Latias is practically unviable. No, Zapdos is amazing. I've always been preaching this, and just sub-roost. Look, it's kind of like Infernape. If the only thing standing between you and Zapdos or Infernape is Latias, then you are just begging to get destroyed by Zapdos or Infernape. So, yeah, Zapdos takes advantage. I mean, they both have U-turn, for God's sake. But Zapdos, I mean, it can do so many things. And even if you do need to Pursuit Latias for it, it's like, okay. So you run that very difficult-to-fit Pokemon, Pursuit Tyranitar. Or Pursuit Metagross, if you like. That can be viable as well. But yeah, Zapdos is just amazing. Whether it's just a classic offensive set, late game agility, specs, defensive, which has a million variations in and of itself, sub-roost, also a million variations, offensive, defensive, somewhere in between. Discharge, toxic, roar, metal sound. Zapdos, a light screen. Yeah, Zapdos is absolutely amazing and should not be as underrated as it is. It's obviously it's not the Pokemon you slap on every kind of team, but I mean even Scarf Zap is absolutely excellent. I mean that Scarf T-Bolt is so much stronger than Rotom's, so much stronger, and it's got the U-turn for early game use. It's got the higher speed if you want to make use of that. It's got a Heat Wave. Yeah, Scarf Zapdos is a brutal late game cleaner against offense. So that's an underrated set, and yeah. That's pretty much, I mean, these are known quantities, so I don't want to overstate the obvious too much. Gengar, I would rank Gengar higher. It's just Focus Blast is such a horrendous move. It's just unforgivable at this point. I can't justify it. Yeah, Wide Lens Gengar, sometimes. But even then, But yeah, Gengar, obviously, if it hits, is one of the scariest pokes in the tier. It's just a shame that if it hits, condition is so unreliable, unbelievably so. So, yeah. There's not much else to say about it. It's great on offense. It's great with spikes. It's great if you sub. It's great if you Will-O-Wisp. It's great if you boom. It's got an endless... I'm just so disappointed because it's so obviously an amazing Pokemon that in practice will let you down because it's going to miss Focus Blast. Starmie. I think Starmie's still good relative to its previous S ranking if you go back a little under a decade. But, yeah, I think what makes Starmie so good... Defensive sets had their use on certain teams, but they are also one of the sets that... The modern stall teams became good in part because they so reveled in destroying Starmie. Like, if Starmie was your method of helping you deal with hazards, then they would just make you pay for it. That was what led to this seismic shift in the metagame. So, not to say that that still can't work, but you can't just slap it on without serious support. And you can't expect it to do that job forever. You more use it to help you extend your longevity, so something like late game Breloom can take over, for example. Spread some T-Waves, slow some stuff down, that kind of thing. What I think makes Starmie really excellent is Specs. I think Specs Starmie is outstanding. Previously, the support that Starmie brought to offensive teams was 3-attack spin. Lefties, and then other items too, like Colbert was very popular. But I think Specs is it, because it's so threatening against defense. With the Hydro Pumps that rip through Clef, they drop Scarf Tar switching in, they blast through Rotom, and if you really want to get nasty against defensive stuff with like Quagsire, or like special defensive Jirachi, then you just unleash a Trick. And you can do that. You can still spin with it. It's obviously amazing against offense because it takes its speed and gets the most immediate power you can get out of it. And that immediacy is really crucial. So, yeah, Spec Army is it. That's pretty much it. Dragonite, I mean, it's simple. You got DD, Mix, Choice Band. I mean, you can also run bulky DD Knight. I think that's underrated. Stuff with Heal Bell. I think that's really a rare support to come by. So if you can fit it, it's cool. You've seen a few teams like that, but it's also really, really difficult to fit and make work. So, very niche. But yeah, I think good old Mix is just a terror. You just bludgeon everything in sight immediately. And it's got that great priority with E-Speed, which gives it a semblance of utility as well. And revenging things like a weakened Gara. And Choice Band, obviously, is just... I mean, DD is always going to be threatening, but again, like with the other DDers, I think it's so much scarier if you set it up late game more systematically, as opposed to just clicking DD and hoping they don't have the right scarfers or walls or priority or whatever for you to make it work. But then again, you know, having to play a non-hyper offense game with a DDer in the back is not always the easiest thing to do because you got to get by with a 5 Pokemon defensive core. And that can be tough, but you know, D-Knight's defensive utility, while definitely solid, it's got great defensive typing. It's just not as, let's say, I don't want to say essential because that really only applies to T-Char, but definitely not as widely applicable as, let's say, Gyarados is. So yeah, D-Knight's. I mean, it could definitely be great if you can, like, if you pair D-Knight with Starmie and you can switch it in over and over again, then the opponent is just in for a world of pain. But if you're using D-Knight over and over again, then you would more appreciate the immediacy of of Mix or Choice Band. So you don't need a setup to be as scary as you can be. So, yeah, that's something to think about. Obviously, DD is great. But I think being able to threaten the opponent as instantly as possible is an important trait. I mean, you can always mix it up. You can literally run mixed DD, just like Salamence used to. Draco, DD, Fire Blast, Outrage. Crazy set. It's actually pretty good. But yeah, you can also pair with either magnets. I've made a video about both magnets recently, so I won't elaborate on those more. So I'll just finish by saying D-Knight's still a great lead, kind of forgotten in that sense, but it's excellent. Great mid-game, great late game. I mean, that Rock's weakness can, kind of annoying speed tier, kind of be obnoxious sometimes, but look, there's also potentially nothing scarier than Dragonite if the opponent is using it well. So, yeah, if anything, I think Mix, and especially Choice Band, well, Choice Band is more forgotten, but I think Mix is more underrated, if that makes sense. So, yeah, Mix Knight, absolute terror. Use it more. Now we go on to B+. These are pretty simple. Machamp leads off or at mid-game subs with paralysis stuff generally. But I think there are ways to use Machamp that are more engaging in the sense that they make you do more than just hope that your D-Punch para combination beats everything. And by that, I mean that you can still have, all the Machamp D-Punch goodness you want, but if you build it a certain way, then you are putting the game more into your hands than just hoping that you're going to BS your way through everything. And what I mean specifically by that is things like Bulk Up and Toxic. So you can not just hope to break through something bulky like Skarm or Hippo just through para luck, but if you bulk up, then you're actually making yourself stronger. So you were just straight up threatening to 2-hit KO them just through strength alone. So I would recommend those a lot rather than just hoping you just pair, because that just can go so wrong. And then you're like, well, I'm smart. I can play the game, but I hinged everything on Machamp nonsensing its way through. And then that didn't work, and I was left out to dry. Well, what if you had a Machamp that was just good in and of itself, and the confusion just really enhanced it, as opposed to just using it as a confusion machine. So that's how I feel about things like Bulk Up and Toxic, which I think is really cool for something like Zapdos. But I generally like Bulk Up the most, because most things that deal with Machamp defensively, they have a lot of really good physical bulk. They have a lot of physical bulk, rather, I should say. So when you bulk up, you take that option away from them. A cool option, actually, someone in the comments when I made that underrated sets video was like, what about close combat? Why doesn't that ever get used? I think an alternative to that kind of Machamp would be running it with Guts and then close combat over D-Punch. And the benefit of this is that you're no longer afraid of Will-O-Wisp Rotom. And the CC boost is obviously nice for blasting through something like Hippo and Jirachi better. But then the defense drop, obviously. And that's another thing about bulk up. It also makes you less easily revenge killed. You know, something like Jirachi Iron Head is going to do a lot less. You know, Metagross Smash, Gyarados Waterfall, Dragonite Outrage, even something like a Scarftar Superpower, because again, Scarftar checks everything, and Weaken Machamp is no exception. So, yeah, bulk up Machamp is it. Very good with Healing Wish support. Lucario is great. I think people they thought Scarf was broken with Copycat, and then there's like, oh, well, Copycat mechanics were fixed, so now it's bad anymore? No, Scarf Lucario was a great Pokemon before Copycat. It's a great Pokemon now. It's that amazing typing, great speed tier, great stab for cleaning up. Strong, fast CC is just wonderful. And great coverage to revenge kill, whatever you like. So, yeah, I think Scarf Lucario is still great. Its flagship to me is still Swords Dance, of course, just because it's one of the scariest late game pokes. It's harder now to set up, I think, because of how popular Fire Punch Jirachi is, one of its worst natural enemies. But if you can make your way around that, it is just vicious. And another way of circumventing this is not going the late game SD route, and instead using Lucario's great power as an early game wall breaking tool. You get in there, you have those big muscle CCs with great coverage, E-speed to pick off things that just barely hang on. So, yeah, I think using it as a wall breaker, especially because it's one of the perfect Pokemon to use Life Orb because it's so not worn down by it. Or it isn't worn down by it, but not in conjunction with rocks and sand because it's immune to. It's got a quadruple rocks resistance, so. Yeah, it's you're really not feeling the sting from Life Orb nearly as badly. So, lots of ways to use Lucario well. I think I'm not super convinced by specs. It's got some nice points for sure, but I mean, the more I think about it, I like more that it's harder to revenge kill because first of all, it's not dropping its own defenses, so it's not weakening itself through Life Orb, and it's not weakening its own bulk, so that it's harder to revenge kill with something like a Latias Surf or a Jirachi Fire Punch. So maybe specs merit some more consideration. Calm Mind, I'm not so crazy about, but yeah, because coverage issues are just great. But the immediacy of specs is pretty cool. And obviously that strong Vacuum Wave is a wonderful revenge killing tool. Azelf, lead Azelf, it's a staple, it's a fixture. I think underrated Azelf, I think Scarf is super underrated. Both as a dedicated lead and just like a late game revenge killer, because it's even faster than Scarf Latias, which is a wonderful trait to have. It's got that fast boom, it's got great coverage, it's got U-turn. So yeah, I like Scarf Azelf in general. And Choice Band Azelf, you don't want to forget Band Azelf exists because it will mess you up. You think you've got that free switch to T-Tar, Jirachi, or whatever, and it blows you up, or it U-turns on you, even worse in the case of T-Tar. It's nasty with Trick if timed well. So yeah, Azelf is cool. And I do wonder if there's some sort of late game, all-out attacking Azelf set that can be put to good use. I mean, its moveset is kind of awkward to navigate, but yeah. And then there's Hippo. And Hippo is obviously phenomenal. But it's a very simple poke, so don't need to expend much time on it. There's I think underrated ways to use Hippo are not using it as a rocker. Yeah, that's because it's got some other cool... Like, if you put Protect on Hippo, it is just death. You do not want to face that. Toxic on Hippo is super underrated. I mean, absolutely ruin Gliscor. And even just sometimes being able to use Roar and Ice Fang on the same set can be wonderful. So, yeah. But that's the experimentation with Hippo. I'm going to take a bathroom break, and then we will continue with B rank. Alright, I've been drinking water throughout this video, so hashtag hydration, gang. Anyway, speaking of hydration, Suicune. Suicune is a great Pokemon, obviously, but it's at this point that we start getting into the pokes that the recurring theme is they're good, but they really need you to help them out. And I think that's what leads people to kind of dismiss them sometimes, and that these Pokemon will reward you if you play well. It's not like if you were using, like, I don't know, Vespiquen, and no matter how well you played, Vespiquen would do nothing because it's Vespiquen. And I am sorry to rag on Vespiquen because I have very fond memories of it because I am a Gen 4 diehard. But these Pokemon are not like that. But they do require more than just autopiloting, so naturally they're going to be ranked lower because that also means that they're harder to fit on teams. But yeah, Suicune is particularly tough to navigate because I mentioned earlier that it's just that longevity issue is so bad. But it's also obviously an amazing Pokemon. It's a great offensive check to a lot of things like Gyarados. It's a big one. And it can be very threatening with offensive 3 attacks. I do think that Rest Talk Calm Mind Suicune is actually kind of underrated, but it's also, going to be more niche even than offensive Suicune, so I understand putting that off to the side. But 3 attacks, you do need some serious anti-clef support. But once you have that, then you really rip through a lot of defensive stuff like nothing. And because most walls in Gen 4 are naturally going to be leaning towards the physical side, or the physical dealing side anyway, and they are not going to be doing as well because like T-Tar is more of a special wall, but it's still not doing particularly well against Suicune, for example. So, or Latias is another example. So, Suicune is particularly dangerous against these, but you got to deal with the Clef, and that's what makes it such a challenging task, because dealing with Clef is difficult. So, you got to really go out of your way to do it, because unlike Superachi, Suicune does not quite have the longevity to deal with, especially because you're dealing with limited Hydro Pumps. If you run Surf, then, I mean, bless you, but the power is going to let you down a lot. But the upsides are great. It's just that there's more risk with it. And, of course, against offense, you're just sitting pretty. It's a great Pokemon to have against those. Infernape, my recent DPP Cup, Infernape, well, it was about DPP Cup in general, but Infernape really shone in that. And that just was a great display of what I've been thinking for a while, which is that I don't think Infernape really fell off. I think people just stopped, it stopped being an automatic win against a lot. And people didn't like that, and like, oh, well, it doesn't even do that much. Like, no, Infernape does a lot. Naturally, it's going to check so many offensive things, from like Superachi and DD Tar are 2 great examples, and just everything weakened. You'll have like a D-Knight at 5%. It's like, well, Infernape Mach Punch. Same with Breloom Mach Punch, for the record, obviously. But Infernape Mach Punch is also better than Breloom's in dealing with SD Lucario because E-Speed does not have +2 priority in Gen 4. And so the faster priority user will beat it. So Infernape will beat Lucario. Infernape Mach Punch beats Lucario to the extreme speed. Yeah. Banded, mixed, what I think it's... you can use a lot of different good Infernape sets. You just have to be very aware of it. And I think Healing Wish really helps a lot. I think, and Latias is such a great Healing Wish poke that you can slap it on fairly easily. A lot of these offensive teams that have been built with like Machamp, I have a couple. I think Infernape works really well in slots like those. That extra speed is just so good. The immediacy and threatening Skarmory, things like that. And Jirachi as well. It's just excellent. So, yeah, Infernape, I think Infernape is terrific. Definitely not like a near BL Pokemon like some people were suggesting. Kingdra. Now this thing is underrated. This thing got completely forgotten once Latias came back. And they're like, oh, well, why do you Specs Kingdra when Specs Latias? Well, I don't know. Stab Hydro Pump. Lack of Pursuit weakness is also kind of cool. But, yeah, obviously, Latias is a better Pokemon overall. But, you can also use both on the same team. It's kind of cool. You got 2 similarly powerful Draco Meteors and... Yeah, Specs Kingdra is an absolute terror. Wonderful typing. or stab combination, very rare, very difficult to resist, both in terms of like literally and in terms of like power. Like Clef does not enjoy switching into. Put it this way, Specs Latias beats special defensive Clef if it's modest, maybe with 2 Dracos, or Trick. Specs Kingdra just collects Hydro Pump, you know. And do you want to switch into a Specs Hydro Pump with Latias? You mean that thing that gets eviscerated by Draco Meteor? I don't think you do. So your average defensive team is not going to like switching into Specs Kingdra at all. And your average offensive team is still going to give Kingdra switch-ins because it's got great speed against most offensive pokes, great typing, lots of neutralities, just good enough, and great natural bulk. So, yeah, Specs Kingdra is it. Bronzong, great poke on defense, obviously. Classic Trick Room sets with things like Mix Knight and CB Tar, never go out of style. They need some support, though, in dealing with Scar and things, but against offense, Trick Room Zong is a death machine. That was not elegant at all. I was going to say Home Wrecker, and I was like, I don't know if that's the most apt way to describe it. And then I was like, Wrecking Ball, Death, yeah. My mind's going all over the place. But the Zong sets I really like. Well, there are a couple. I like Lead Zong, which basically acts as a Metagross, but with Heat Proof, you get a built-in Aqua Berry. So you can also run Lum and Custap, as you would on a lead Metagross, but with an Aqua Berry built in. Obviously, it's not as strong, but you got the surprise factor going for you. So I like those sets a lot. Lum especially is really nice to turn the tables on Breloom. But Custap is obviously Custap. It's amazing. And then I also like anything that tricks. Choice Band is great because the immediate power on something like Gyro Ball is just monstrous. And you ruin Scarm or Rotom or whatever, much like you would do it with a Metagross. And Trick Iron Ball is similarly effective. Yeah, I used to have this team I really loved with Trick Iron Ball Bronzong on a Spikes team. And it something like making Scarm or Rotom take Spikes damage is just the best thing ever. Yeah, Quag. Quag's a great poke. And it fits on defense really well. And that's about it. I mean, especially defensive used to be the norm. Now it's more physically defensive to take on D-Deers. But it's got Encore in its moveset. And Encore lasts a long time in Gen 4. So, yeah, it's pretty simple. You take on... It's very unique in what it does in that it takes on both physical attackers like the D-Deers. It's not an Ironclad DD Night Answer, but it's like good against most DD Tars. Unless it's Life Orb DD Tar. Life Orb DD Tar rules. But it's very rare. Takes on DD Tar, takes on Gara, and it also takes on things like Specs Hydro Pumps. So, yeah, that's it's a very rare trait. So, yeah, Donphan, as I've always appreciated Donphan, and so have a couple other players, but it's really become more of a popular choice recently, in that people realize, wow, that typing, that physical bulk, that move pool, Rock Spin, Knockoff, Strong Stab, EQ, Ice Shard. Yeah, it's all the potential in the world. I don't even think that like Odor Sleuth spin or Foresight spin is that good. I think there's better ways to get around the ghosts. It's got too many other great moves to bother with something as often useless as Odor Sleuth. Think of it in a similar vein as like slotting T-Punch or Pursuit or something onto Scarf Metagross. It's just use the better moves. Use the EQ, Spin, Protect, Knockoff. That's a great set. That's just one example too. Donphan's really good. So... yeah, it fits on a lot of teams. Offensive, too. It's not just a defensive poke. And I think it being able to spin quite reliably without fear of like Pursuit, like Starmie, the other most reliable spinner, does, really opens up a lot in terms of team building. You could even run something like a Spec Starmie and a Donphan on an offensive team together, just off the top of my head. And you could be a lot more free with your Specs Hydroing because you don't need to spin with Starmie as much, and that means you are much more able to run a mixed Dragonite. You know, Spec Starmie, Donphan, Mixed Knight. Then you get in some. You start stacking your steals. You can get a T-Tar and a Jirachi or Metagross in there really nicely, and then you can. Your last slot you have some flexibility, but you do have to watch out for ground. So, you know, Breloom might be okay there. Yeah, actually, you got to be more careful of fighting as well, I think. Yeah, Latias is always a good choice. I'm just making this team off the top of my head. I haven't thought about any deeper synergy. But, I think you can generally get by without having an ironclad fighting answer in that last slot, so long as you're really careful about your other pokes. It also depends, like, if the Scarfer, if you're on, like, something like a Scarf Heatran as the steal, then that is naturally going to be a fighting check in and of itself, as long as you don't collapse late game to Scarf Lucario, of course. But if you got, like, a Mach Punch Breloom, then that's why Scarfers and, like, Priority go so well together. You know, the Scarfer can't deal with everything, but Scarfer and Priority, you are going to be handling most speed-boosting threats well. And obviously you need some bulk so you don't just collapse to the things that don't die to Priority or Scarf, i.e. Agility Metagross or Trick Room Bronzong. But yeah, that's something to consider. So Spec Starmie, Donphan, Mix Knight, or CB Knight possibly. Oh, you know what you could do? Spec Starmie, Donphan, Scarf Magnezone or Magneton, T-Tar, CB Knight, and then yeah, I like that. Actually, maybe I'm over exaggerating the fighting thing a little. May, Knight, Donphan, Mag, T-Tar. That last might want to be a Breloom, yeah. Something to think about. Anyway, there are lots of good lasts you could use there. So yeah, that's cool. You could, hey, that might also be a good place for CB Flygon, really. You could do the Knight Flygon double up. Anyway, but I do like what Breloom brings there. Now, Infernape might even be okay there, but I think Breloom's longevity is more appreciated. So yeah, give that a try. See if it's any good. Me, Spec Starmie, Donphan of some sort. I don't know what the rocks and stuff yet, but the structure is there. Spec Starmie, some sort of D-Knight, physically oriented, probably banded. Because with Mag support, you can run Dragon Claws. You don't have to Outrage to deal big Dragon-type damage. Spec Starmie, CB Dragonite, Donphan, Tyranitar, Scarf Magnezone or Magneton, and Mach Punch Breloom. You got the double Priority, too, and a good Scarf. So yeah, that's a good team. It can handle offense, it can handle defense, and the details are now up to you. So, Gastrodon, Storm Drain does not give you a water immunity in this generation. That's very important. So what does Gastrodon do? Well, Sticky Hold means you are immune to Knockoff and Trick, and that's really big. Gastrodon's also got a great HP stat, it's got Recover, it's got great bulk, so it can act like a kind of Quagsire that can do really well in games against other defense. So you've got, and it's got Yawn, which is a great move, of course. It's got an interesting move pool. Not quite as deep as you'd like, but it'll definitely get the job done. So I like it on some niche, some bulky teams. Roserade really hates the air of Clef, but it's still got its uses. Scarf Raid is a great lead, just a great revenge killer against offense. And its double hazard stacking days are no longer going to be as valuable, but it is still a nice alternative to Skarmory on certain very aggressive offensive teams that can leverage its use, so that if your opponent is running Latias Clef stuff that's going to hover above or ignore both hazards, then they are vulnerable to your sweepers, like say DD Tar. So Scizor, I think CB Scizor is actually kind of underrated, which is funny because it used to be the #1 Pokemon in the game. But Scarf Scizor is okay, but I think bulky offensive. Actually, the popular Scizor set right now seems to be Akka SD, which is interesting. But I think bulky SD, with the longevity of lefties and the reliability of Roost, and obviously the priority to pop in and out of the game whenever you like, it's just such a phenomenal late game sweeper when the fire moves are out of commission, or when you're out of Jirachi's Fire Punch range. And I think that needs to make a comeback. Blissey, hey, Blissey's still a great anchor for bulky offensive stuff. And it's pretty simple other than that. Yeah, I mean, look, special offense stuff that takes advantage of Clef being the new special wall, they do not want to face a Blissey. So, more niche, but yeah. Nidoqueen, I think Nidoqueen is still great. Just that ability to switch into fighters so nicely is so wonderful. T-Spikes, Rocks, wonderful move pool. Roar, Taunt, Super Fang, that's really nasty for stall teams to face. That should be used more, because it's like, oh, well, it doesn't do anything against defense. No, that's because your moveset doesn't do anything against defense. Nidoqueen has the tools. Yeah, can punish Machamp really nicely with Poison Point and U-turns really well. Milotic, I think it needs to get her due again, because it kind of got overshadowed by Quagsire being rediscovered, but Look, Milotic's ability to take on things like Mixed Knight is just a thing of beauty. And it is much more offensively apt because it's very naturally fast. Hits 198 with no investment, which is naturally going to outspeed a lot of Breelooms. Hits quite hard for such a defensive Pokemon as well. So dealing with it is actually a much larger constraint than your average bulky water, for which you would imagine something like Vaporeon. So, yeah, Milotic is still a great Pokemon and deserves to be used more again. Slowbro and Slowking, I'll patch them in here because Own Tempo gives you an immunity to confusion, so you are great against Machamp, especially because Payback, well, it does do double damage on the switch in DPP, then you're also slower than Machamp, so its Payback actually goes first, so it's effectively the same as Stonehenge. You can shrug those off and slack off, and you're fine. Yeah, Slowbro in particular has such great physical bulk that it's not really afraid of T-Tar's pursuit. I mean, not that it's totally unafraid, but it doesn't immediately, quaver in the face of it. So, it's great T-Wave, it's got a good special attack, it's got a good move pool, obviously, Ice Beam, Fire Blast, Psychic, can get a lot of things going. So why Slowking with that lower defense stat? Well, the higher special defense is very nice for dealing with things like Heatran, first of all. Second of all, it's still good at dealing with Gyarados, you just gotta find a better spread. But, you can EV them to functionally have the same stats, right? So what's the difference? Why wouldn't you just run special defensive Slowbro? Well, Slowking gets Nasty Plot. And this lets it potentially rip through bulky stuff late game really nastily. Way more efficiently than something like Calm Mind Slowbro. So, yeah, that's pretty much it. And sometimes you would even want them to think, oh, well, why is it not Slowbro? Well, it's Slowking, so it must be Nasty Plot. And if it's functionally going to be the same thing. So you have that going for it as well. Raikou is an underrated poke. I mean, its defensive profile is not good, but it's fast, so fast. Strong, great coverage, great natural bulk. It's so fast and naturally bulky and strong that it winds up being best against other offense. That great speed tier, T-Bolt. Even if you don't run Aura Sphere, it's naturally so nasty. Just because T-Bolt, HP Ice off that speed, outrunning Latios if you're not running Aura Sphere, because Aura Sphere means that you need to run Rash. But if you're not, then you go plus speed and you outrun Gengar and Latios. It's amazing. But if you do run Aura Sphere and you do run Rash, then your special defense takes a bit of a hit. Fine. It's totally worth it because you're hitting... First of all, it's a special attack boosting nature, so you're hitting really hard. And Aura Sphere is such amazing coverage. You crush T-Char. You crush Heatran. And defensive teams aren't going to like dealing with you either. If you got like a Calm Mind and a Lumberry. Clef? Nuh-uh. Latios, you got the Lumberry for the T-Wave. Clef gets destroyed by Aura Sphere. Obviously, sometimes you want to run things like Shuka Berry so you can take a Hippo EQ. So again, team support, you mix and match based on what your team needs, but the potential for Raikou is just insane. And even Scarf Raikou I think is pretty cool. If you don't want to run the Rock's weakness of Zapdos. Plus it's faster, even with a special attack boosting nature, so. Mamoswine, potential of course, but that lack of a strong Ice Stab is just... And its defensive profile is so awkward. But it can run, it can get 101 HP substitutes for Clef. It can knock off Scarm's lefties or Shed Shell if you want to trap it. Ice Shard is obviously a wonderful priority move. Stab EQ is just devilishly strong. And yeah, it's always tough to get a good build out of Mamoswine. It is going to make your setup of both its set and your team a little bit on the awkward side. But the rewards can be huge. Celebi's got some good stuff going for it. Obviously, a million resistances, and great move pool. People have been using rocks on it, T-Wave, and what stands out to me the most is just Healing Wish, really. So, then there's Uxie. Uxie is a great poke. It's just a good defensive utility thing. Rocks, U-turn, knockoff, T-Wave. Good against fighting types, which is really important. And yeah, that's about it. Oh, I don't have Mesprit on this list, but I really should, because Mesprit is basically Uxie, but it has Healing Wish, and that's really important. Can't emphasize that enough. So yeah, and now our final four are the C+, which are potential, but then I left out a lot more. A lot more is viable in this, but I didn't really feel like going over, Feraligatr and stuff, even though I think Feraligatr is actually pretty cool, but... Yeah, Togekiss, I mean, that defensive, that typing is just so, So not good, but it's move pool, its stats is just through the roof. I think you can obviously do like nasty plot T-Wave or like nasty plot Heal Bell kind of stuff can be pretty nasty. I think offensive 3 attacks nasty plot is really underexplored. Talk about strong aura spheres ripping through defense. That should get tested some for making defense cry. And I know Panamaxes used to use this lead set with Charty Berry for arrows, and now would be good against Scarf Tars as well. I think Scarf Togekiss in general is a great Pokemon, and that should be explored more as well. Yep, simple. Rhyperior, whether you're running Bandit or sub 3 attacks on paralysis sets. I like Rhyperior as a para-abuser more than Machamp, honestly, for the simple reason that Rhyperior is so much stronger that you find it relying on just its power and coverage moves as opposed to needing confusion or like the boosting of SD. Not to say that sub SD Rhyperior is bad, but I think EQ Stone Edge Ice Punch is so good. Although some players have used EQ Ice Punch Stone Edge, and I think that's a good set as well, so your mileage may vary. Abomasnow is a good Pokemon in and of itself. I think it's very disruptive for a lot of play styles, just with the presence of its Snow Warning. Nothing like, canceling out Jirachi's Leftovers, for example. That in and of itself is enormous, absolutely huge. And it's also a good wall breaker with offensive sets. Leech Seed sets you don't, spam as easily with Clefable around. That's a big change from how Abomasnow used to play. But you can also make it pay with strong Wood Hammers. So, lots of potential for Abomasnow. And Venusaur, another casualty of Clefable, but I think Venusaur is not so out of luck as Shaman in this regard, because Venusaur's got Sleep and it's got Knockoff. So you can very quickly make Clefable Roo switching into you. And that's it. This video is crazy long already, so thank you for watching / listening. I hope you enjoyed. I assume most of you probably listened, but yeah, that's what I'm here for. Thank you for watching / listening. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one.